Okay, so nobody, you just all come to class, so there's no need to listen to the integrity recordings. Oh, one other thing. Last week I mentioned a banquet on Wednesday, March 1st. It's going to be my spring bankers banquet where we have a lot of bankers from the area come in. And I said that if you are graduating in May or finishing in May, August, or December, that you can come to the banquet. I'll buy you dinner. You get to talk to some bankers, regulators, and other business people from the area. If you're not graduating at that time, then you're more than welcome to come hear the program, which is at 7 o'clock. But then you'll get to come to the banquet next spring. So I've got some invitations up here. I'm not quite sure how many I'm going to need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass these out. I'll just pass the box around. If you can go, okay, now if you, for example, if you say, hey, I've got to work that night or whatever, or, I just can't go that night, whatever it might be, then, of course, don't worry about taking an invitation, please. But if you can go, take an invitation. Also, sign your name here so I'll know how many I've got. So when I'm looking for other seniors, I'll know who's got an invitation, who doesn't have an invitation. Okay? So it's pretty simple. If you can go, take an invitation, sign your name. If you can't go, I'm sorry. Okay? So let me just go ahead and pass that around. Also, there's an RSVP on there. I think you need to RSVP by the 24th, maybe, something like that. It'll tell you. You can either email or call to let them know that you are coming to the banquet. And by the way, the food is pretty good. So, pretty good meal, pretty good presentation. We've got a couple guys from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis who are going to be here. They've been a big help to our graduates. We'll have quite a few bankers there. So if you can make it, please try to do that. All right. Other questions, comments, complaints? I know it's Valentine's Day. I can see the look on your faces. A lot of you look sad. Okay, I'm sorry. I can't do anything about that. You should have planned better when you scheduled your classes. So since we're here, we might as well talk about bank financial statements. How about it? Okay. All right. Now, if you happen to print these off, you know that there's about 70 slides from these two chapters. There's a lot of information here. As a matter of fact, I'll go ahead and tell you, a lot of this information that we're going to talk about tonight is the exact same stuff that I present when I teach at the Barrett Graduate School of Banking in Memphis to bankers who have been in the business anywhere from 3 years to 30 years. Because a lot of times when you go to work for a bank, for example, if you go to work in the deposit area and you're in a small town bank and you've been in deposits for 15 years, you may know everything there is to know about deposits, but you know nothing about the asset side of a bank, or you know nothing about the financial statements of a bank or how to analyze the financial statements. And so, again, a lot of this stuff, this is the same information that I taught last May, that I'm going to be teaching again this May. I've just got to update it. I've got to get all my stuff into them by the 1st of March. So, again, this is real world, pertinent, really good information. Now, as we take a look at bank performance, and again, bank performance takes on several different meanings, but basically what we're doing, we're going to analyze what we call pertinent information. So, I mean, that takes on several different forms. It could be financial statements, it could be income statements, balance sheets. There's something called a UBPR, which we'll look at probably next week, the Uniform Bank Performance Report. And then also banks have a lot of internally or externally generated documents that consultants provide for the bank. If you're doing something, which we get when we get to chapter 7, I think it is, we'll talk about asset liability management, loan performance, etc. So we're going to basically take a look at these financial ratios to tell us the story of how a bank is performing. Now, the key thing to remember here when we're looking at a bank's financial statement, we're trying to answer these questions. So we're trying to answer, for example, how do we monitor this? How do we measure how we're doing as a bank? Do we measure it against our goals, budget projections, local peers, national peers? And can we recognize which direction we're going? Because if we're going the wrong way, we need to do something about it. Ask the 500 plus banks that have failed since 2008, and they will tell you that when you start spiraling downward, that you need to fix the problem pretty quickly. Because if not, as we'll talk about tonight, you start making bad loans, you're going to run through your allowance for loan and lease loss, then you're going to run through your profits, and then finally you're going to run through your capital, and you're going to be undercapitalized, and you're shut down at that point. So that's kind of just in simple terms how it works. So, in answering these questions, basically we're trying to do all of this. So there's a lot of information. So this is going to be something like you might have seen in Finance 330 when it came to ratio analysis, but it's going to be like Finance 330 on steroids, okay? A little bigger, a little meaner, a little faster, but it's ratio analysis nonetheless. Now, we're going to focus on two of these, okay? The balance sheet for a bank. This is also called the report of condition. And then the income statement for a bank, which is called the report of income. And again, next week, I don't think we'll get to it this week, we're going to look at something called the Uniform Bank Performance Report, which is typically 37 pages. Sometimes they're a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, but 37 pages of solid numbers. I'm talking solid, small numbers, like think size 8 font, page after page after page after page after page. Okay, so when we look at that, again, I don't expect you to know all of that, but I will show you how you can use a UBPR, for example, if you're researching a bank, if that's what your paper is going to be about. You may have a bank that you deal with or a bank in your hometown. You say, hey, I want to research this bank. Well, the UBPR is a fantastic place to start in terms of researching the financial condition of your bank. The problem is there's so many numbers there, it can be overwhelming. So we'll kind of break that down a little bit. All right, so I guess it doesn't click. Okay, so the first one. First financial statement, the balance sheet. Just like with any corporation. Okay, so you're familiar with balance sheets of a normal non-financial corporation. A bank's balance sheet presents a summary of a bank's financial position at any given point in time. So normally, we measure it as of year end, December 31st, 2016, 15, 14, whatever. Although banks legally have to file something called a call report. And they have to file the call report every quarter. So at the end of March, end of June, end of September, and the end of December. And so a lot of times when you see balance sheets, you may see them in a quarterly format. So it's really important to first identify what am I dealing with? What kind of information do I have? And just like with any balance sheet, it balances the bank's assets, which is what it owns, against its liabilities, what it owes, and its stockholders' equity, what was provided by the owners of the company. The difference here is sort of how it's set up. So, if you can locate your sample bank balance sheet, and it should be a front and back, if you can locate that, then let me bring mine up. All right, so where are we here? My sample bank balance sheet. Right here. Okay, so that is a little better. Okay, now I've made this about as large as I can make it and still fit on the screen. But you will notice when you're looking at yours, okay, we're going to focus first of all on the front side of the balance sheet. These are the assets of the bank. So I tried to make it just easy to follow. So the front side is the assets. The back side is the bank's liabilities and stockholders' equity. And then there's some other memorandum items at the bottom that are going to come in handy when we start actually working through ratios. So let's take a look at each of these just kind of quickly as we go down through here. So again, this is just any bank. Okay, this is 3 years worth of data, so December 31st, 2016, 15, and 14. The first item we have here under assets are a bank's loans. And this is one thing that you're going to have to get your mind wrapped around as you're looking at things from a bank's point of view. Because up until this point, when you've looked at balance sheets and you saw a loan, typically that loan was on the liability portion of a balance sheet. That's where a corporation had borrowed money. It owes that money back to the lender, and it's a liability. For a bank, loans are typically by far the largest source of assets. And you've got lots of different types of loans. And so depending on the bank, they can kind of break these down in different ways, depending on if they specialize in a certain type of loan. This bank, this is kind of just a generic type loan portfolio. They have real estate loans, so this bank, now these are in millions of dollars, so this bank has $278,558,000 in real estate loans. Commercial loans, and we'll talk about loans more later in the semester, $37 million, these are loans to businesses. Individual loans, $13 million. Ag loans, $802,000. Other loans in domestic offices, then there's no loans in foreign offices. Now, this is a breakdown here. Loans held for sale, loans not held for sale. And again, we'll talk about this when we get to the mortgage chapter and the securitization chapter. But essentially what this is saying is that banks, depending on the bank and what they're trying to accomplish with their balance sheet, sometimes they will make a loan fully intending to sell that loan. Because when they sell the loan, that means that that loan leaves their balance sheet and it frees up cash that they can then make more loans with. Or they might decide to invest it in some type of government bond, for example, if they're trying to change up the ratio of their balance sheet. So this bank has a few loans for sale, but notice most of them are not. Okay, so they're keeping these, what do we call this, in-house loans. So it's keeping these on the balance sheet. They have $329 million worth. Then we have what's called the allowance for loan and lease loss. I think on the ratio sheet, I may just have this as the allowance for loan loss, the ALL. This bank has set aside $5,764,000 for potential bad loans. So this is a really, really key line item. If a bank thinks that a loan's going to go bad, they're going to set some money aside in their income statement, which we'll look at in a minute. And they're going to do this each quarter, every 3 months. The money flows from the income statement into the allowance for loan and lease loss. On the income statement, it's called the provision for loan loss. On the balance sheet, it's called the allowance. And so this bank has decided they need about $5.7 million for loans that may not pay back. And we talked a little bit last week, or maybe the week before, about lending. Lending is very risky. So the riskier a loan portfolio, the larger the allowance for loan and lease loss. But again, this is based on several different items. It's based on history. It's based on the type of loans that you have. It's based on just sometimes you may kind of see that there are things that are going wrong. For example, we talked about last week the tire plant in Union City closing. If you hear rumors about a major employer in your area closing and you have loaned a lot of money to their employees, you're probably going to want to start building up your allowance for loan and lease loss. It may be a rumor. That's fine. If you have to, you can take money out of this. The money doesn't have to stay there. As a matter of fact, if you've looked at bank profitability over the last 2.5 years, roughly, you'll notice a lot of banks are making what looks like really good money. If you look at their ROA, the return on assets, which we'll calculate later, or ROE, and you're thinking, wow, things must be good in the banking industry because these banks are making a profit compared to 2010, 2011, 2012. But we look at the failed bank list last week. What was happening in terms of bank failures in, say, 2009, 2010, 2011? Had a lot of banks failing. You had a lot of other banks that weren't failing, but they were barely hanging on. They had a lot of bad loans. And so what they were doing, they were pumping millions and millions and millions of dollars into these allowance for loan and lease losses on their balance sheet. Now, a lot of those banks, because of the economy getting a little better, the real estate market getting a little better, and because of some help from the government, a lot of those banks survived. They straightened things back up, cleaned things back up, and business started getting better. Their loan portfolio started looking stronger. And so what they've been doing over the last 2.5 to 3 years is instead of making positive additions to this, they've had negative provision for loan losses on their income statement, which is bringing this number down. Now, those negative provisions on your income statement is the same as making interest income or non-interest income. It makes your bank look more profitable. So when you take a look at banks over the last 2 or 3 years, and if somebody just glances at the industry and you say, wow, look at that average ROA or ROE for the banking industry for 2015, it looks really good. Well, it does look good, but a lot of good things, and they're earning a lot of interest income from the loans and investments. A lot of it's coming from simply they're drawing down their allowance for loan and lease loss. So it's kind of a fake profit. And then once we subtract this, we've got the line item net loans and leases. Okay, so again, another very important number. Now, when a bank accepts deposits, typically there's 2 things that they can do with those deposits. Now, there are a couple other things, but 2 major things. They can either loan them out or they can invest them. Loans are the best interest producer for banks. Banks like to make loans. I mean, that's why they're there. And depending on whether they specialize in ag loans or commercial loans or individual loans or credit card loans or whatever, it's going to make a difference in as to how profitable the bank is, but also how risky the bank is. If a bank can't loan out all the deposits, or if it doesn't want to loan out all of the deposits, or if it's maybe a very conservative bank, then it's going to invest the deposits. And since the bank is investing your money, your deposits, the government says you're limited to the types of investments you can make. So they're not going to let your bank take your deposit money and buy shares of Twitter. They can't buy shares of Under Armour. They have to invest in investment grade, typically government-based securities. Things like United States Treasury and agency securities, which this bank has 71 million worth. Municipal securities, we'll talk about those in a minute. Who can tell me, what is a municipal security? Okay, it's bonds issued by states, city governments, county governments, whatever. Now, banks are huge investors in municipal securities, municipal bonds. There are 2 main reasons why. Who can tell me one or both of those reasons why banks invest so heavily in municipals? One, taxes. Municipal bonds are typically free of taxation. What's the second reason? And it has more to do probably with marketing than anything else. Publicity. That's exactly right. If your local school system is issuing $50 million worth of bonds to build a new grade school, it just looks good if your bank buys $25 million worth of those bonds. I mean, you're in a small town especially, everybody knows who bought the bonds, and they're going to try to support that bank. And when we're looking at munis, again, banks are huge investors in municipal securities. Okay, this is, foreign debt securities, so none of those. All other securities, so just kind of a catch-all category. Interest-bearing bank balances. This is what the bank has on deposit at other banks. So just like you have a checking account or you have a CD at a bank, banks have that too. It's not unusual. So banks have money at other banks that they can use for various purposes. We've got Fed funds sold. We're not going to worry about the resales here, just Fed funds sold. Can anybody tell me what are when we talk about federal funds or Fed funds, what is that? What are we talking about? Okay, yeah, that's exactly right. Fed funds sold or Fed funds are overnight loans between banks. So you've got one bank that needs money, you've got another bank that has excess deposits. They will loan money overnight. So 5 p.m. the money goes out, 8 a.m. the next morning the money comes back in. And you may think, well, who needs money overnight? That's a really short period of time. Well, keep in mind, some banks are located in areas that have heavy loan demand. And so for ratio purposes and for regulatory purposes, they need to show they have these deposits. So they're more than willing to borrow the money overnight, a little bit of interest, and then send it back to the bank the next day. Now, of course, they'll probably do the same thing the next night. So if a bank has excess deposits, even though you're loaning the money out for 12 hours or whatever, it still adds up. And if you're a bank that needs to borrow money, even though you're borrowing it for 12 hours, it's still helpful when it comes to your ratios. So Fed funds sold, that's an asset. This is a bank that is selling some of its deposits overnight. When we get to the liability side, you'll see something called Fed funds purchased. And that is a bank that is borrowing Fed funds overnight. So that's a liability. And then we've got sometimes trading account assets. This bank does not have trading account assets. So total investments, $125 million. Now, just looking at these major assets, you can see for a bank, you've got to have people who have a lot of expertise in various types of lending. For example, agricultural lending. Everybody can't make ag loans. Commercial lending. Every lender can't make loans to businesses. Individual loans. Most people can make individual loans, although there is some specialty involved. So you've got to have a lot of different lenders. Also, when it comes to investments, you've got to have somebody working for your bank handling your investment portfolio. And a lot of times people don't think about that, who really know what they're doing. Because you can make a lot of money in investments. You can lose a lot of money in investments, even though they tend to be safe, but you've got interest rate risk to keep in mind. So if interest rates go up, what happens to the value of your investment portfolio? Goes down. Interest rates go down, it's going to go up. Which direction are interest rates heading right now? Where are they going to go in the future? They're going to go up, okay? I mean, I will stand up here and guarantee you interest rates are going up in the future. So that means the value of a bank's bond portfolio or the investment portfolio is going to be going down. And for those of you who have taken investments or maybe portfolio management, you probably talked about hedging techniques. And so if you think the value of your bond portfolio is going to go down, then you can buy derivative instruments to help offset that decrease in the value of your bond portfolio. So this gets a lot more technical than what we typically think about a bank. You know, we typically think, okay, I see the loan officer, I see the tellers, whatever. I mean, you need some really, really smart people in there handling the investment portfolio. And occasionally, if it's a big enough bank, you will have different people handling different types of investments. Okay, so we've got so total investments. We've got some other assets here, cash and due from banks. This is simply, as the name implies, this is the cash that the bank might have on hand or on deposit with the Federal Reserve. Or a lot of times you have checks that are written and the cash is coming into your bank. It's just not there yet. And so that's what we mean when we say due from other banks. We've got premises and fixed assets. This is the building, the land, the computers. If the bank has a company car or company cars, whatever, they've got $10 million here. They've got something called other real estate owned. I simply abbreviate that as OREO. OREO is simply foreclosed property. So any kind of real estate that has been foreclosed on, whether it's a house, whether it's a business, whether it's an apartment building, whatever, goes in here. So this bank has $225,000 worth of OREO, or foreclosed property. Now, you may think, you know, that may be a lot, but actually it's not, because look at the previous year. Had almost $2 million worth of OREO. That means they were foreclosing on a lot of properties, and they've been selling the hell out of some properties over the last year to get down to $225,000. Now, that's something that a bank doesn't like to do. Contrary to what you see in the news, banks don't like to take people's property. Sometimes you have to. You just don't have a choice. Or a lot of times customers are simply walkaways. And a walkaway is somebody who does just that. They will leave the house keys on the kitchen counter. They will load up the moving truck and they will leave. And it's up to the bank to figure out, what are we going to do with the house? I mean, and in 2008, 9, 10, 11, there were literally tens of thousands of walkaway properties that banks had to do something with. They had to try to find buyers for it. Sometimes these properties were subdivisions that were half finished. You had houses, maybe they were framed up. You might have 100 houses framed up in a subdivision. That's it. And the developer couldn't borrow more money, had a shortage, and so basically they just walked away, and the bank is left with a half-finished subdivision. What do you do with that? You're not in the home building business. So you've got to line up and figure out, do we want to sell it like this? Is it going to be more profitable for us to finish it out and then sell it? I mean, what do you do? How do you handle it? So that was a big problem. They've got bankers' acceptances and other assets. Total assets, $494 million. This is going to be a really, really important number. And then also average assets during the quarter, which was $490 million. Okay, so this one's not quite as neat as this one. Okay, so I've got some liabilities here. Okay, so if you turn to the back of the balance sheet, liabilities. Now, this is what the bank owes other people. Mine's a little bit different than yours. They've got the first two categories here at the bottom. These are deposit accounts. And you can see this bank has different deposits. What's another name for a demand deposit? A checking account. Okay, that's exactly right. So demand deposits for checking accounts, they've got $25 million. What is a NOW account? What does NOW stand for? I thought you were going to jump on that one. NOW stands for Negotiable Order of Withdrawal. Negotiable Order of Withdrawal. So that is similar to a checking account, You tend to be more limited on the number of checks you can write, but they tend to pay interest or higher interest. A lot of demand deposit accounts, banks love demand deposits, especially if it doesn't pay interest, because they get to use your money essentially free. And so, I mean, they want as much of that free money as possible, because then they can loan it out or invest it. And what they're looking at, the difference, which we'll talk about later, is called the interest rate spread. It's what they earn on interest versus what they pay in interest. Now, this will be the back of your sheet. But they've got money market deposit accounts. So again, just a slightly different type, $7 million worth. Then they've got other deposits of $212 million, and time deposits. These are certificates of deposit under $250,000. They've got $74 million worth. Now, this $212 million, this is going to be primarily savings account. So this big number here, the $212 million, this is going to be like your passbook savings. You may know why they call it a passbook savings account. Most of you probably have never even seen a passbook. I should have brought mine. I've got one at home. A passbook is a small, typically green book that whenever you opened a savings account and you would put money in or take it out, the bank teller would literally write in the book, withdraw $100 on a certain date and your remaining balance. Or if you deposited $50, they would write in there $50. And that's how you kept up with it. So you take your passbook in, you show it, hand it to the teller. You want $50 out of your savings account, they take it out, they write it in, and you can see how much you have. Okay? That's kind of ancient history. We don't do that anymore. Now we get on our phone, we bring up our bank's app, and we check our savings account balance, savings account or checking account balance, whatever it might be. Now, I want to point out one thing. Notice, well, let's see, where should I start? I'll start here. Core deposits. All of these accounts, demand deposits, now accounts, money markets, other savings, and time deposits under $250,000, this bank is calling these core deposits. And let me give you a definition of core deposits. Core deposits are deposits that you expect to stay in the bank indefinitely. Core deposits are deposits that you expect to stay in the bank indefinitely. So in other words, this is money that you can count on being there. If interest rates go up, your customers, your core deposit customers, they're going to keep their money in your bank. Interest rates go down, your core deposit customers are going to keep their money in your bank. Some of you may be like this. You may have a local bank that you've dealt with since you opened up your first checking account, and you're not changing. And more specifically, your parents or your grandparents may be like that. It doesn't matter what another bank is paying in interest, they're going to keep their money in a specific bank. Now, that's opposed to what we call interest rate shoppers. Interest rate shoppers will move their money from bank to bank over a 0.25% interest, 25 basis points. Now, you're going to hear me talking about basis points quite a bit, so let's make sure we understand basis points. 1 percentage point is 100 basis points. So if I say, for example, 25 basis points, that is 0.25%. So for example, from 6% to 6.25%. Or if I say 50 basis points or 200 basis points, 200 basis points, 2 percentage points. Some people shop deposits, and for 25 basis points, they will move from one bank to the other. It's just how it is, and banks know that. So what you've got here, you've got CDs that are divided into under $250,000 and over $250,000. These tend to be shopped more often than the smaller CDs. So these are your $1,000 CDs, $20,000, $50,000. Also, this is where your FDIC insurance stops. Let me ask you this. Why would somebody have deposited in a bank more than $250,000? For what? More interest, because this is also called a jumbo CD, $250,000 or more. And so these jumbo CDs, depositors know they have more negotiating power with the bank than with a smaller CD. For example, if I go into a bank and I say, hey, I want to take out a $10,000 CD, but I'm not happy with the rates you're paying, they're probably going to tell me, I'm sorry, that's the rate we're paying. You can either take it or you can leave it. If I go in with $250,000 and tell them I'm not happy with the rate they're paying, then they're more likely to negotiate with me in terms of paying me a higher deposit rate. Because again, remember, you're thinking about this from a bank's point of view. So you're thinking about, what am I going to have to pay to keep this deposit or to get this deposit? If you're making loans, you're thinking about, how much can I charge the customers for various types of loans.
Your banks know this, so if I walked in with $225,000, would they still be asked with the
That-
would they be like, oh, you're not quite a jumbo CD, and you're also not out of FDIC insurance, so we're pretty much not going to do it?
That's a good question. And that's going to depend on several factors. One is, it's going to depend on your relationship with the bank. You know, if you've been a customer there for 30 years, they might negotiate a little bit with you. If you're a brand new customer, they may not. Also, how much do they have in deposits? If they're flush with deposits, if they've got more money than they know what to do with, which for 2 or 3 years recently, some banks, and I've had bankers in this classroom, in my Finance 537 class, who have said, we've got customers who bring us money, and in all honesty, we don't want that money, because we can't loan it out. So why should we pay interest on it if we can't loan it out? Or Treasury bonds are paying such a small amount that between what we have to pay the customer and what we earn on our Treasury bonds, we can't make any money. So they actually don't want those deposits. So it kind of depends. You know, if they've got more money than they need, they probably won't. If they're in an area with heavy loan demand and they need every dollar of deposit they can get, they know they can loan the money out at 7, 8, 9%. Yeah, they may negotiate with you on that $225,000.
So when an economic, like a depression or something like that, you could walk in there with $225,000, they would be more apt to take that money because they don't have what's left for a surplus left.
If during a recession, they're probably not going to be making many loans, so they're probably less likely to take that money, or they're less likely to negotiate with you as opposed to during an economic upturn. And so this bank has $383 million in deposits, which again, that's going to be an important number to us a little bit later. Now, we've got some other liabilities. And again, keep in mind, these deposits are liabilities. When you look at a traditional corporation, deposits are assets. But this is something that you owe your customer. So if your customer comes in and says, I want to close out my checking account, that's a liability because you have to give them back their money. Now, you've got some other deposits, or excuse me, other liabilities. We've got federal funds purchased. So we talked about Fed funds earlier. So this bank, sometimes they sell Fed funds, sometimes they buy Fed funds. So they've got $25 million. You've got federal home loan borrowings maturing in less than a year, federal home loan borrowings maturing greater than a year. Then other borrowing, bankers' acceptances and other liabilities, kind of a catch-all category. And then they have total liabilities of $445 million. This bank has equity capital, again, a really important number of $48.3 million. And total liabilities to capital of $494,320, which should match up with our assets here of $494,320. And then here, you've just got some basic information that's going to be helpful when we start calculating ratios. Loans to bank officers, there's one loan for, it looks like $1.6 million. They've got securities that are broken down into held to maturity versus available for sale. They've got some brokered deposits, and brokered deposits tend to be the jumbo CDs. So if you need deposits and you're willing to buy deposits from California, you'll pay a premium, but if you need those deposits, you have to have them. You don't really have a choice. You've also got net loan charge-offs. Okay, charge-offs, this is something we'll talk about a little bit later, but this bank has charged off $1 million in loans. Now, we talked about loans going bad earlier. And so if you have a loan that goes bad, so let's say you loan $10,000 to a customer to buy a car. That customer pays on the loan for a few months, and then they stop making payments. So the balance on the loan is $9,000. Eventually, typically after 90 days or 120 days, you're going to go repossess that car. So you go get the car, $9,000 is owed on it. You're going to have legal fees associated with it. You may have a repossession fee. You're going to pay somebody to go get it. So let's say you've got $1,000 tied up in that. So now the customer owes you $9,000 plus $1,000 in fees, interest. If you need to insure the car, I mean, that's not free. So the bank calls the insurance agent and say, hey, we've got a repo, we need to insure it, and you're going to charge that to the customer. So let's say the customer now has a total of $10,500 owed on the loan. The $9,000 plus $1,500 in other stuff. You've got the car sitting in your bank parking lot. You put it up for sale, put an ad in the paper, whatever. Somebody comes by and says, yeah, I like the car, I'd like to buy it. They pay you $7,000 for the car. You're owed $10,500. So you've charged off $10,500. That's what goes in this account. Then you sell the car for, what did I say, $7,000. That's called a recovery. So that's money that you get back. So now you've got $10,500 loss. You've recovered $7,000. You still have a $3,500 loss that falls into this category, net charge-offs. Because that's the net amount that you have charged off on loans. Now, at this point, you have a decision to make as a bank. You can either sue the borrower for the remaining $3,500. Problem is, it's going to cost you probably $2,000 in legal fees to sue the borrower for $3,500. The borrower, if you know anything about them, maybe you know that they don't have any money, and so you're suing them, but they can't pay you. So you might garnish their wages, but it's going to take you 5 years to get your money back. So a lot of times, they're just going to write off the additional loss. They're never going to get it back. But there are some borrowers who, because of they're just really honest, or maybe they're just circumstances beyond their control, which happens all the time. Maybe there's some medical bills or something involved, or maybe they go through a divorce. These people, even though they lost their car, they owe the bank $3,500, they're going to continue making payments to the bank until they pay off the $3,500 that they owe the bank, because it's simply the right thing to do. And so when somebody comes in and makes a $100 payment on that $3,500, it's going to go here. So it's going to reduce this amount by $100. So that's what, when we talk about charge-offs, that's what we're referring to. Loans that have gone bad, what you've lost, what you've sold items for, and the net amount is your net charge-offs. You've also got risk-weighted assets. We'll talk about risk-weighted assets a little bit later. You've got total earning assets. Earning assets are assets that earn interest. Any asset that earns interest, loans, investments, anything else is an earning asset. The bank building, some people might try to argue that's an earning asset, because how are you going to earn money if you don't have a bank building? A bank building is not an earning asset. The computer system at the bank is not an earning asset. The company car that the bank owns is not an earning asset. Loans, investments, and anything else that earns interest is only an earning asset. That's it, okay? So this bank has $450 million worth. They have 149 full-time employees. So this could consist of, they may have 2 people working half-time. That's considered 1 full-time employee. They've got non-current assets of $3 million. A non-current asset is an asset 30 days or more past due. And they've got loans 90 days or more past due of $500,000. So this is basically they can be more complicated, they can be less complicated, but this is what a bank balance sheet looks like. You need to know extremely well what a bank balance sheet looks like. Okay? As we'll talk in a minute, you need to know what's an asset, what's a liability. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. All right, so are there any questions about the balance sheet of a bank? The reserves are going to be found here. Cash and due from. So the cash that the bank has in the vault or the cash that the bank has on deposit at the Fed, their reserves, that's going to be found typically there. Okay. Good question. Other questions? All right. All right, so the balance sheet. Now, some of this we're going to talk about, some of this we're going to skip through pretty quickly. This is kind of a summary of what we just talked about, assets found on the balance sheet, also called the uses of funds. So what is making the bank money? Loans minus their allowance for loan and lease loss, their investments, their Fed funds sold, and any balances that they have at other banks. Again, this is anything, it's kind of hard to read here. This says any asset that earns interest income for the bank is considered an earning asset. Non-earning assets, cash and due from, premises and other fixed assets, other real estate owned, and intangibles. You need to know all of these really, really well in terms of the first test. Okay, liabilities. Deposits, Fed funds purchase, Federal Home Loan Bank advances, any other borrowings and subordinated notes and debentures. So these are basically bonds that the bank has issued. Then you've got equity capital. You've got preferred and or common stock, you've got surplus, and you've got retained earnings. So that's basically just like any other corporation. Now, this says under liabilities, it says we can't forget what's called off-balance sheet items. And off-balance sheet items, these are things that they don't show, just like the name implies, they don't show up on the balance sheet. But at any second, they could show up as a liability and could cause a lot of trouble for the bank. For example, it says a standby letter of credit. Can anybody tell me what that is? A standby letter of credit? Anybody in the car business, or it could be other businesses too, but okay, a standby letter of credit is simply a letter from the bank stating that you will loan a customer X number of dollars. So for example, let's say you're a car dealer and you go to the car auction in Nashville on a weekly basis. Well, even though the people there may know you, I mean, still, if you buy 20 cars and you buy, $300,000 worth of cars, they want to make sure that if you write them a check, that check is good. So typically, you're going to have a standby letter of credit from the bank saying that Bill Smith, we will loan Bill Smith up to $500,000, and for that service, they're going to charge Bill Smith a fee. So that's part of what's called non-interest income or fee income. Now, Bill Smith may go to the car auction and not buy a single car, but he still has to pay for that standby letter of credit just for having it. Now, if he does go to the auction and buys $300,000 worth of cars, that goes from no money that you're giving Bill Smith to $300,000 that you're now giving him. And so these standby letters of credit, see, that doesn't show up anywhere on the balance sheet. So when you get to things like letters of credit, futures or forward contracts, interest rate swaps, loan commitments, etc., these are things that we're not analyzing because they're not there. But tomorrow they might be, and they might put our bank in a pretty precarious financial position just because some of these items showed up overnight. So it's kind of hard to manage off-balance sheet items, but you need to be aware of what could possibly happen. So you have to do a lot of what-if analysis with these. Okay, a lot of this I'm going to jump through pretty quickly, okay? This is going to go back to deposits, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted it here so you could take a look at it yourself. Sources of funds. Where do banks get their money to lend out or to invest? Well, deposits. We talked about that. So transactions, savings, etc. They've got borrowed funds. So Fed funds purchased, borrowing from the Federal Reserve, repurchase agreements. Most banks around here wouldn't have Eurodollar borrowings. Long-term borrowings, so this would be bonds issued by the bank and or some source of bank capital. And you can see here, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see basically where a bank's funds come from. For example, this is borrowed funds, the blue. This is savings deposits, the green, so 33%. These are jumbo CDs. These are small CDs. These are checking accounts. So, you know, if you're a bank, what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize, for example, this orange slice of the pie. Because this is almost free money, or sometimes it is free money. Whereas these jumbo CDs, this hot money, this may be here tomorrow or next week. It may not, depending on what's happening with interest rates and how much you're willing to pay. Now, uses of funds, this is what the bank does with the deposits. So it keeps it in cash, it makes loans with it, it invests it in various, we'll talk about mortgage-backed securities later in this semester. Fed funds sold, repos, which stands for repurchase agreements. In banking, if you say repos, they can take on a couple different meanings. And then fixed assets. And fixed assets is kind of a it's kind of a tricky area for banks because banks want to look successful. It's not an accident that most banks are made out of brick or stone. That's not an accident. That's not the president of the bank simply saying, I prefer brick. How many banks do you see with vinyl siding? Nothing wrong with vinyl siding. It's just, what does brick or stone convey about your bank? Your money's safe if it's in this big brick bank. Banks tend to be big. They tend to be impressive looking. When you walk in, you're going to see typically really nice floors. Maybe you're going to see the furniture is going to be really nice, typically leather, nice leather chairs. Why don't they just have folding chairs in the bank? They want you to think, this bank is successful, this bank is wealthy. If I put my money in this bank, it's all mental. I put my money in here, it's going to be safe. When you walk into a bank, typically the vault door is always standing open. And it's standing open at an angle, so when you walk in, you can see the thickness of that vault door. And they're huge. Overbuilt by a long shot. They don't have to have a vault like that. But why do they have the vault door standing open so that when you walk in, you can glance at the vault and you can see the thickness of that door? Same thing. Look at that vault door. My gosh, if I put my money in that vault, it's going to be safe. When I deposit my money, they're going to walk it to the vault. They're going to set it in there. They're going to close that vault door, and it's 100% safe. Again, most people not understanding that their money is not even in the bank. We talked about the fractional reserve system first week of class, second week of class, whatever. Okay? But again, it's all about appearances. Also, names are important to banks. Banks pay a lot of money to consultants to come up with just the right name. For example, I'll just pick on a couple banks here. Independence Bank. Independence Bank plays on the American spirit of, yes, we're independent. Yes, we can take care of ourselves. They've got the 1776 and the Declaration of Independence and all of that everywhere in their phone numbers and everything else because they want that American spirit, that American pride. That's one of their main marketing ploys. And if you look at other banks, if you've got banks, and if you look at some of the names, if you just go down a list, you're going to see some that are just, the Murray Bank. Nothing wrong with that. It states where the bank is located, but there's nothing really, extremely special about it. But if you look at nationwide, if you look at the name of some banks, you're going to see banks, names that give off strength, reliability, dependability, independence, that type of thing. So those are all really, really important when it comes to the banking game and what you want customers to think. This is where banks use their funds. Now these are the loans here, so notice real estate loans tend to be, for a lot of banks, the largest, although it doesn't have to be. Commercial loans, you notice investments here about 21%. This is going to vary a lot among banks. If you've got a bank that is very risk averse, and when I was a regulator, I'd go into some of these banks, they might have a tiny portion of their deposits actually loaned out. It's almost impossible to get them to loan money out. They take the deposits, they invest it in government securities. That's it. They're happy with it. A lot of the money is family money. They don't want to take a big risk with it. And so, they barely fit the definition of a bank, but they do minimally, so they can do what they want. Nobody says a bank has to loan other money out. It's just how much profitability do you want. If you're an independently owned bank, if you've got stockholders to report to, you probably want to maximize your profits and maximize stockholder wealth if possible. If you're a family-owned bank and everybody in here is a member of the family and we're taking care of our own money, we don't want to take much risk. We're happy with it sitting there, being invested in government securities, making 2 or 3% right now, and that's what we're going to do. We're not going to change the way we run the bank. So this is what the bank's balance sheet essentially should look like, where you've got cash plus investments, we call these security holdings, plus loans, plus miscellaneous assets. So this is going to be fixed assets, etc. Should be equal to deposits plus non-deposit borrowings plus stockholders' equity. Again, that's a pretty good formula for you to know, to write down. Oh, I forgot to tell you too, and we'll talk more about this when we actually get around to talking about the test. But in this class, I let you have a formula sheet, but it can be formulas only, and you make it out. Okay, in Finance 330, I gave you a formula sheet. You can have one piece of paper, 8.5 by 11. Okay, it can be front and back if you want to, but it can be formulas only. So you can't have notes, you can't have lists, you can't have bank assets are loans, investment. You can't have any of that. You can just have formulas. So for example, this is allowed. This is not allowed. And by the time we get to the test, if you don't know that C stands for cash, you're probably screwed anyway. So it's not really going to make much difference as to, what else you write down. All right, so as I mentioned, it's really important to know the different types of bank assets and liabilities. The bank balance sheet is opposite from what you're typically used to seeing with a traditional non-financial corporation. And we need to know what creates interest and non-interest income and expense, which we're going to take a look at in just a minute. All right, so a lot of this I'm going to jump through here. Cash assets, securities, investment securities, trading account assets, Fed funds sold. Loans, we've talked about that. Different types of loans. Now, this is the allowance for loan losses. We said this is found on the balance sheet. This is how much you've set aside for bad loans or possible loan losses. So, and again, this is a formula, so you can have this on your formula sheet. As a matter of fact, I think one of the questions at the end of the chapter, which I'll show you those in a minute, from chapter 5 and chapter 6, suggested problems to work, has you working through one of these. But this has, okay, we've got at the beginning of the year, the allowance for loan loss. Then we add to that from our income statement the provision for loan loss. This is called the adjusted allowance for loan losses. Then we would subtract any charge-offs, so bad loans that we made. We add to that any recoveries. So this is either we've sold the asset or a customer simply come in and make a payment on a bad loan. And then we have our ending allowance for loan losses. And the reason that we focus on this is because when regulators come into your bank, they take a really close look at how much money you have set aside for bad loans. And keep in mind, the provision, this comes out of earnings. So this is not something that banks like to do. So if regulators come in and say, you haven't set enough money aside for bad loans, we want you to take out an extra $1 million. That's an extra $1 million coming from earnings. And again, that doesn't make you happy. That doesn't make your stockholders happy. So that's another reason, in addition to the cushion, the emergency cushion this gives you, you want to try to minimize your loan losses and make the best loans possible because you don't want this money flowing out of your income statement. Then we've got reserves. Now, if, for example, let's say you've made a loan to a real estate developer, and it's looking, nothing's happened yet. He's been behind on his payments almost every month, but eventually the real estate developer makes the payments. But it's looking pretty bad. And you're thinking one of these days, it may be this month or 3 months from now, but one of these days, that loan's going to go south. This developer's going to file bankruptcy, and we're going to lose a ton of money on this. Well, in that case, if it's a big loan, you may set aside some money just for the potential of that loan going bad. Or if you don't do it, the regulators may tell you to set aside a certain amount of money just in case that loan goes bad. And so it says to designate a portion of the allowance for loan loss or add more reserves to the allowance. Then you've got what's called general reserves, which is simply the remaining amount. So this could be for any other loans that might go bad. And as it says here, the amount that you set aside is determined by management, but is influenced heavily by taxes and government regulation. So if regulators are feeling extremely risk averse, they're going to make you set aside more money. If they're less risk averse, then they're probably going to let you set aside less money. And then you've got miscellaneous assets, bank premises, other real estate owned, goodwill, and other intangibles, etc. All right, I'm going to jump through some of these real quickly. Deposit accounts, non-deposit borrowings, equity capital, off-balance sheet items, which we've talked about these. And then this is another example of, this is a really, really simple balance sheet. But you can see, for example, I mean, this is what we're doing here. And this is just a really, really straightforward example. You've got assets, okay? This is what the bank owns. Cash, Fed funds sold, investments, loans, allowance is subtracted from it, and then fixed assets. You have liabilities, which is what the bank owes other people. So that's mainly deposits, largest source of liabilities. You also have what the owners have provided, so the equity capital. And then you have assets have to equal liabilities plus equity capital. All right. And by the way, I left it this way. You'll notice when we get to some of these, like this one, for example, and it's got the little spinning stuff, and this one's actually not too bad. But some of these, I had a graduate assistant work on this for me, and I said, hey, I've got this presentation I'm making to 200 bankers. It's about bank financial statements. It's not the most exciting information in the world. I need you to spice it up a little bit for me. Okay, make it look as good as possible. So the graduate assistant goes to work, starts working on it. I look at it initially, and I'm looking at it going, I don't really see what they've done here, because I just printed it out. And of course, when you print it out, all this stuff just prints out just like this. Well, I'm in front of 200 bankers presenting this for the first time, and I'm going through clicking this with a clicker, walking around the room. And I had some other information besides this, but I start clicking it, and all this stuff starts flying in, starts spinning. Some of it spins for 10 or 15 seconds, so you're sitting there waiting to see what it says before you finish it. And I'm talking to these bankers, I'm like, I'm really sorry, okay? I don't know what's going to happen next. But they thought it was kind of funny, so I actually just left it in. So now every year, one class is 3 years worth of classes. One class tells the next one, okay, when you get the Lacewell's class, okay, and you got the spinning stuff that comes, okay, that's about the highlight of his presentation. So you just got to wait for that. All right, this is the balance sheet. Any questions about a balance sheet before we move to an income statement really quickly? Okay, you got two choices. We can take a short break, or we can just keep pushing through and get you out of here earlier. I don't know. Depends on how fast I can. But which is it? End the suffering as soon as possible?
Yes.
That's what I would go with.
Since I dropped the ball, came too late, can I get an income statement and balance sheet, please?
Yes, you can. Okay, by the way, so did I, for the people also, if somebody is graduating, or if somebody changes their mind and decides you want to go to the, to this banquet, that's fine. If you want to go, just take one of those, sign your name. Okay, so bank balance sheet. Again, you need to know this really, really well. Okay, the income statement. A bank income statement is just like basically any other income statement should look like. The only difference is the source of the income. And when we're looking at an income statement, typically it can cover any time period. So you can have a daily income statement, a monthly income statement, or an annual income statement. And you should have one in your information. So if you would, let's take a look really quickly at the bank's income statement. Now, what you're going to notice here is a bank's income comes from two main areas. its income is either interest related or non-interest related. That's it. Okay? So interest income comes from loans and investments. Non-interest income, also known as fee income, comes from non-sufficient fund check charges, renting out lock boxes, fees that you might charge to originate a loan, any type of non-interest related income. So that's it. I mean, it's pretty simple. Interest related or non-interest related. So for this particular bank for year end 2016, it has earned interest and fees on loans. Now again, we're going to break this down in a minute more. So incomes on loans and leases, $20 million. You've got treasury and other investments, $5.7 million. And then you've got interest on items that are due from banks or a catch-all other interest income. Okay, so total interest income, $26.4 million. Now, this actually shouldn't be here, okay? I call it this, but when we say fees, the fees are actually going to be on the second page, okay? When we get to non-interest related items, which should be somewhere. Okay, non-interest income, which is here. Okay, so let's go. So here's the first page. So the interest income, $26 million. Now, this is interest expense. And again, it's pretty simple. Expenses come from two different areas, either interest related or non-interest related. This bank pays interest on time deposits of $250,000 or more, so jumbo CD, $694,000. Interest on all other deposits, $3.1 million. Interest on Fed funds purchased, $93,000, and interest on other borrowings, $1.2 million, for total interest expense of $5.1 million. So this bank has net interest income, which is interest income minus interest expense, of $21.3 million. That sounds like a lot of money. Sounds like the bank's doing pretty well. Now, the problem is, so far, we've only collected interest and paid out interest. We haven't, for example, paid our employees, which is a really, really large expense. It's a non-interest related expense. Now, we have non-interest income of $6.9 million. So again, this is basically fees. These are all the bad checks that people write. These are all the safety deposit boxes, etc. Then you've got non-interest expense, almost $16 million worth of non-interest expense. This is paying your employees, paying the electric bill, paying your servicers, whatever. You've got your provision for loan losses. This is what we're taking out of the income statement and putting on the balance sheet in the allowance for loan and lease loss category, which leaves us pre-tax operating income of $10.4 million. These are our gains or losses on our held to maturity securities. So they're going to go up or down in value. So we made $7,000, not a whole lot. Gains or losses from available for sale. Taxes, net operating income, and finally net income. So this bank has made $10,222,000. Now, out of this, as we talked about way back in Finance 330 or any finance classes you've taken, typically a company can only do two things with this net income. It can pay it out in dividends. It can put it in retained earnings. That's it. So this particular bank decided out of the $10.22 million, it's going to pay $5.1 out in dividends to stockholders, and it's going to put in retained earnings $5,122,000. These two equal this. And that is basically what a bank's income statement looks like. Now, again, I'm going to jump through some of these pretty quickly. So this kind of sums up what we just talked about. Interest-related items found on the income statement. Now, this formula is going to be useful when we start calculating ratios. It says net interest income is equal to interest income minus interest expense. So we've got interest income sources. We make interest income from loans, taxable securities, tax-free securities, and then other interest income. We pay interest as a bank on deposits, short-term debt, and long-term debt. So this is interest flowing in. This is interest flowing out. You need to know these very, very well. I see some of you writing as fast as you can. Okay, this is non-interest related items found on the income statement. So non-interest income, non-interest expense. And you've got something called net non-interest income that is equal to non-interest income minus non-interest expense. And you may want to make a note here about this formula, maybe out to the side, that this formula is typically a negative number. Okay, so net non-interest income is typically a negative number. And again, when we work through the ratios, that's going to be more important to you than it is now. The reason being, normally your largest non-interest expense is your employee salaries. And so, I mean, you're paying your employees, that's a lot of money. That causes non-interest expense to be typically much larger than non-interest income. But if you look at banks, and we talked for the last couple of weeks about this, banks have really been focusing on this type of income lately. And the reason is interest rates are simply so low and there's so much competition, they can't do much with interest. So their interest income has basically kind of been shut down. They can't really increase it, so they've been focusing on non-interest income, such as fees, service charges, trading account gains and fees, and any other source of additional non-interest income. Then you've got non-interest expense, wages, salaries, and employee benefits. This is going to be the largest. Then you've got premises and equipment and other operating expenses. Now, when you get over here, for example, premises, bank premises. As we talked about earlier, banks tend to build big buildings. They tend to be expensive buildings. And it was pretty popular, still pretty popular in some places, to build really large bank buildings. I mean, huge buildings. And some people would think, why are they spending that much money on a building? But normally the bank has already negotiated with other firms to lease space within the bank building. And it's actually a pretty smart idea, because if the bank overbuilds initially and they lease out the space for a few years, as the bank grows and they need more space, they don't have to build another building. They can simply start, I hate to use the word evicting, but asking their tenants to leave that they're renting to, and they can start taking over the additional floors of a bank. So if you see a small bank in a town building a 5 or 6 story building, sometimes that's not by accident. Okay, a lot of people look at it and go, they just want that to look good, they want to try to impress people. Well, it's actually a pretty smart business decision. Now, sometimes banks will speculate on property. For example, Murray is moving north. Okay, we're up 641. And so you may have a bank speculate on a piece of property out here and pay $500,000 for it, thinking in the future we may build a branch that direction. Now, they can't hold that forever, because that's not an earning asset. So regulators, I mean, they'll let you do that for a while. They'll let you own it for a while. But if you don't have a plan for that piece of land, eventually they're going to make you sell it. Because again, a bank's not in the real estate business. Bank is in the business to make loans. So if you're owning that land, you don't have any plans for it in the next 4 or 5 years, you're probably going to be forced to sell it. All right, service charges. Again, we're not going to talk about a lot of these, but I mean, some of you have seen these maybe on some of your accounts. Fees for writing excessive number of checks, overdraft fees, maintenance fees, stop payment fees, etc. Trading account gains or losses. This is if a bank is buying and selling bonds, and typically this is frowned upon. They don't want to do this a lot because they're not a bond trader, but occasionally they will have bonds that they specifically set aside for trading, and they can buy and sell those, and if they have a capital gain, they can take that capital gain. And then you've got other types of fees, insurance commissions. How many of you, some of you work for a bank, I know, how many of your banks, if you know this, sell credit insurance? Do you know what credit insurance is, like credit life insurance? What is it? What is credit insurance? Like credit life insurance? Okay, so if you take out a loan at a bank, your loan officer may say, hey, you know, you're borrowing $30,000 for a car. What happens if you die before your loan's paid off? We offer something called credit life insurance that if you unfortunately pass away before your car's paid off, before the loan's paid off, this insurance will pay off your car loan. And your wife, your kids, they're not burdened with having to pay off this loan. It sounds really good. Okay, they also sell credit accident insurance, which if you're hurt at work and you can't work, then it will make your loan payments while you're off work. And so you hear this, and if you're not really up to date on what life insurance costs or should cost, just basic plain term life insurance, you may think it's only an extra $30 per month, and I can pay off my $30,000 loan. If something happens to me, my wife and kids don't have to worry about it. Well, keep in mind, if you're in your mid-20s, for $30 per month, you can purchase $1 million worth of term life insurance. Whereas with this, you're purchasing $30,000 worth of term life insurance. Term being the term of the loan. So it's a huge ripoff for customers. But the way it works is typically the bank keeps half of the premium, the insurance gets half of the premium. So it's a big money maker for banks. Huge money maker. So they can't force you to have it, but they can talk to you about it in ways that you feel terrible if you walk out without that credit life insurance. Come on, man, your poor wife, she's going to be stuck with this payment, this truck you're buying. You know, come on. I mean, and again, it's kind of interesting because it's such a big moneymaker for banks that they have contests a lot of times. And the loan officer that sells the most credit life insurance will win a trip to the Bahamas or something. I mean, so they're really pushing that, okay? I hate to say it, but I've sold a lot of credit life insurance in my time as a loan officer. And for a lot of people, you don't even have to mention it. They ask for it. It's just, I mean, they're so used to paying it that when you loan the money, you don't even mention it, because I wasn't a big fan of credit life insurance. I knew it was a ripoff for the customer, but the customer will say, hey, what about the credit life insurance on this loan? How much is it? Where do I fill out the application? And you're kind of like, are you sure you want this? I get it on all my loans. Credit life insurance, I need it. Well, what am I to do, okay? They want it, I'll sell it to them. It's not a very good deal, but that's how things work sometimes. Okay, and then here's our simple income statement. We may have some flying arrows here. Okay, so this is the net interest income. Again, interest income minus interest expense. This is gross income. Now again, these terms are going to be important as we work on a ratio. So this is interest income plus non-interest income. It's the gross income of the bank. The provision for loan losses, this goes to the allowance for loan loss on the balance sheet. The non-interest income minus non-interest expense equals net non-interest income. And again, this is typically, if you notice here, it is negative. You've got net income after taxes, the bottom line of the income statement, which we said basically can go two places, dividends or retained earnings. That is it. Okay, that's basically what you can do with it. Now, in taking a look at this and taking a look at something called the earnings power formula. So if we want to break down the return on equity for this particular bank, now I'm using these numbers. So I'm using the numbers from the income statement and the numbers from the balance sheet that we looked at earlier, the simple balance sheet. Let me get back there. Okay. Now, I realize this is kind of hard to go turn the lights out for just a minute. Okay, don't go sleep on me. Okay, so you've got, again, net profit margin. We're going to work on that next week. That's equal to net income divided by gross income. We multiply that by the asset utilization ratio. That's equal to gross income divided by total assets. These two together equal return on assets. Net income divided by total assets. If we multiply this by something called the earnings multiplier, which is total assets divided by equity capital, it's going to give you the return on equity, which is looked at very closely by regulators, managers, and stockholders. And as we take a look at this, and we can put some numbers with this from the balance sheet and the income statement that we just looked at. So here's the same formula. These are the numbers. You can go back and take a look at these numbers later if you want to. And you can find that the net income, 25, the gross income, 238. So that's going to equal 10.5%. We then have the asset utilization ratio, which is equal to gross income of 238 divided by total assets of 1950. That equals 12.21%. The ROA, return on assets, again, this is looked at really, really closely by regulators and management. It equals 25 divided by 1950, which is 1.28%. And you may think, wow, that's not a very large return on assets. 1.28%. Well, as I think I've mentioned earlier, if you can maintain as a banker, if you're running a bank and you can maintain an ROA through good times and bad of 1%, one single percentage point, you're going to have a job for life. So if you're a $100 million bank, an ROA of 1% means you're making $1 million in net profit. Doesn't sound like much. But again, that's why banks are so conservative, is because, and they've got the reason that they have that allowance for loan and lease loss, is because they can't afford to make very many bad loans. It's going to zero out everything they've got set aside, including their profit, really quickly. And then we've got the equity multiplier, which is equal to assets divided by the equity capital. And so this is not a percentage, this is actually 11.47 times. And that takes us to the top, which is our spinning return on equity, which is equal to net income divided by equity capital, which for this particular example is equal to 14.71%. Now remember, just like you learned in Finance 330, this is not necessarily the return that the investor in bank stock makes. It's just the return on what owners have added to the bank in terms of ownership or equity. So, return on equity depends on these three items: equity multiplier, net profit margin, and the asset utilization. And if you kind of go in, if you have time, if you go back and kind of take a look at some of these numbers, you can see how even small, I mean tiny, tiny changes in any of these can magnify your earnings or magnify your losses. Banking is an industry of very, very small changes. So you can make or lose a lot of money by just shifting your equity multiplier up or down, shifting your net profit margin up or down, or shifting your asset utilization up or down. All right, this is a good place to stop. What we're going to do next week is, again, bring back your income statement, balance sheet, and your sheet of ratios. We're going to jump in and calculate some ratios next week. We're also going to talk about your test. And also, before I forget it, let me show you this, just in case any of you want to start working on these. From Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, these are some practice problems that I would suggest, if you get a chance, working on. So from Chapter 5, practice problems 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10. And from Chapter 6, practice problems 4 and 5. You'll find on Canvas the solutions manual, so you can find the answers to this. And if you would like to work through any of these in class, that's fine also. Okay? So I just want to go ahead and give you these so that you can start working on them. Everybody have a great week. Have a good night. I will see you back here next Tuesday night to finish up chapters 5 and 6. Also, we need to talk about the test next week also, okay? So be thinking about that.